Welcome to the second episode of Kilokol Podcast. I'm Richa.
And I'm Alia. Today we'll be interviewing forensic psychologist Dr. Samantha Lodrigan and her experience in the forensic industry.
Trigger warning, there will be discussions about rape and sexual assault.
Let's dive in and murder.
Hello, my name's Sam Lundrigan. I'm a professor of investigative psychology and public protection at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge, and I am the director of a research institute called the Policing Institute for the Eastern Region, and we work nationally and internationally with criminal justice agencies and governments, mostly the police actually, in terms of trying to help, using research to help combat public protection issues on harms, both online and offline, such as child sexual abuse, sexual violence against women and girls, and terrorism and extremism. And I have been in this job for about, the director of the Institute for about 7 years now.
Oh wow, yeah. So what would you say is a typical day like for yourself?
Oh, a typical day, that's a good question. So actually it's interesting. So a typical day now post-COVID in terms of geography typically is home-based. So I do a lot of work from home because the type of work I do can be done from home, apart from obviously when I'm doing research, which is less and less often these days because I've got a team of researchers sort of doing that hands-on research, which is a bit of a shame because I missed that. I do my role is very much strategically sort of running the institute, directing the institute in terms of its strategic direction, going out winning funding, talking to people, doing lots and lots of meetings with external stakeholders, but it's very varied. So, one day I might be, squirreled down writing an application for funding to the European Union, for example, and that takes a lot of sort of, effort and concentration. Another day I might be meeting with, the Australian Commissioner for Safety and having a meeting about potential collaborations. So the one thing about my job is it's hugely varied and incredibly busy. I do quite a lot of travel. So in the next 10 days, for example, I'm going to Berlin, then Washington, then Toronto, and then Florida, all in 10 days. So there's a lot of demands in terms of, but it's exciting because you get to meet lots of people who are, I think in my job are particularly so committed and passionate about what they're trying to do, which is protect vulnerable people really from harm. And one thing you do learn from doing a job like this is when you talk to practitioners who work in the sorts of spaces we work in terms of things like child sexual abuse and violence against women and girls, their jobs are so difficult and sensitive that you've just got to be passionate about it. Otherwise, I don't think you'd be able to do this job. And I think that's what sort of keeps me going is as difficult as it is, because I do spend a lot of my time looking, seeing and reading about very, very difficult things. It's about what keeps you going is the fact that you're hopefully going to, your research will help improve practice and policy. I guess the other thing to say about the day-to-day is what in this job is I'm a real proponent of this, is it's really important to look after yourself and your well-being. So I take the well-being of my team very seriously, and I work very hard to make sure that everyone is okay, and actually when they're not okay, it's okay to not be okay, but let's make sure you get the help, some support, or you take a break. And because as I say, the world we live in is can be very traumatic and distressing for some of the things we have to deal with.
Yes, of course. So what would you say is your most favorite and the least favourite part of your job?
That's a good question. What's the most favourite and the least favourite? So the least favourite part of my job is doing things like budgets for bids. I'm not got a very good head for figures. So that sort of admin side of it. I mean, I have a business manager and an administrator who do a lot of that and help for me. But those sorts of sort of budgeting for things. The favourite part, so dealing another worst part is probably some of the internal processes at a university can be quite clunky, like human resources and that sort of thing. Favourite part, I've got loads of those. I love my job. So the people I meet, it's just inspiring. The team I work with are incredible. We're like a family. So I would say the people. The people is one thing that makes me want to, get up and work every day. The knowing that the work we do is having such an impact, potentially. It's not research for research's sake. We don't just do some research, write it up, publish it in an academic journal. The whole point of for me, running through the heart of what we do is about having impact, doing research that's applicable to the real world and can actually help. So when we get some really good results in that respect, that's really rewarding. So yeah, people and the impact we make are probably the two best bits about my job. And the travel, actually, the travel, and the fact that I don't have to report to anybody. I can work from home, or I can work from, I can work from anywhere, basically. No one's telling me or checking up on me, which is fantastic.
So it's very fulfilling.
Yeah, very flexible as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned that the sort of emotional component to your job with like the cases you handle in that. Would you say there was like a particular crime that you found very emotionally challenging, perhaps when dealing with like very high profile criminals or rapists, that maybe after you handled the client, you found it hard to kind of distance yourself, like separate your work life from your private life within it?
Yeah, so I'm pretty good at, well, actually, do you know what? It's interesting you mentioned that. So I've always thought I've been pretty good at doing that, separating what I do from, my non-work life. But actually, in a series of conversations I've been having recently about researcher well-being, I've realised that I'm not actually that good with it. And actually, my work has really impacted on some of the ways I behave normally that I've always thought is normal, but actually now I've started to think about it, I realise perhaps it's a function of the job I do and the sort of the view I've had of the world through it. So I'll come back to that in a minute, but to answer your first part of your question about is there a particular case that resonates with me, so there are many cases, and I think that's part of the important thing about this job is to make sure that nothing ever just becomes a piece of data, if you like, because obviously I deal with, cases are turned eventually into data that we research and analyse and so on. So what I have to always remember is that behind every, number in an Excel spreadsheet is a human being, a victim, a perpetrator, and usually some very devastating harms happened. But the cases, I guess, that probably that have most impacted me are the ones that always the ones involving children, especially young children, unsurprisingly, are very difficult to get out of your head, and some of the immense cruelty that I've had to see perpetrated against obviously the most vulnerable people in our society can be very, very difficult, especially when you've got children yourself. So yeah, I mean, I wish, yeah, and it does never cease to amaze me just how much harm there is being perpetrated every day on children, and there's no way, and it's made me realise that in many respects this is a good realisation to come to, is that there's no way that we can ever just use a law enforcement response to these issues. We've got to start looking at it differently, because of course when you just look at things from after a crime's been committed, the harm's already happened, okay? And the police come in to try and catch somebody, and I help them try and do that. But actually, what we really need to be starting to look at is actually we need to try and start preventing these harms from happening in the first place. Start changing the narrative about some of these crimes. There will always be individuals who will be absolutely determined to rape, murder, whatever it might be. But for, a lot of the crimes that happen, there must be things we can do. You think about a lot about violence against women and girls. It's so everyday now. It so permeates all of our worlds, right? This everyday sexism, for example. And I know sexism isn't a crime, but it's the thin end. It's a one end of a continuum about the way women and girls are treated in society, and we need to start at that sort of early age to start educating young men to start getting rid of some of these, because that's where it starts. And some of these people go on to commit terrible sexual offences and so on. But we live in a society where we're not very good at challenging that yet. And then just going back to how do you keep it separate? So I think I'm pretty good. So if I go to a crime scene and I work on a crime, and that means, when I do that, it's like an warts and all look at it in terms of, nothing's sanitized. Or if I'm doing research on online child sexual abuse, for example, where I have to view hundreds of images of child sexual abuse in order to try and understand it and perpetrator behaviour and so on. I'm sure you can imagine what that's like. So you have to try and put it in a compartment. I never do that sort of work at home, because if it's at home in my living room or even in my study, then I've sort of brought it into the house. Aside from the fact I have kids and I need to keep these things separate, that's one thing. But I have realised that one thing, I guess, that has had an impact on me, and I spoke to so Sasha, my daughter, went to Hills Road and she did psychology. She did, of course she did. I've been talking to her about it, and I think as parents we're always like, be careful, don't talk to strangers, all those usual messages, especially as young, that we give you as young women. But I think maybe I've been hypervigilant because I know what can happen, as rare as it is in some cases, as in most cases. I think I've sort of maybe been a little bit too hypervigilant with my own behaviour as well. So when I go running quite a lot, or I used to. I haven't done it for ages, but I'm always on the lookout for. This is going to sound really ridiculous, ladies. For sort of whether that good places for disposing of bodies. I mean, it's so ridiculous, and might thinking I might come across one, and I'm always very vigilant if anyone else is around as well, probably more so than most people. But I don't know, maybe not. Maybe this is what we have to do as women these days. Anyway, long answer to a short question.
Yeah, I guess it's harder because you know the actual reality of all of it.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is weird because it's a combination. It's, on the one hand, I know very much what can happen, and I'm talking about really, crimes that result in really devastating, the most serious types of crimes that can be committed. I know, but I also know, so I know what they look like and what can happen, but I also know about the evidence and how often they do happen, which is actually not that often. So it's a difficult sort of tension between the two that I have to try and manage and not make the world too scary a place for myself or anyone around me, actually, especially the women in my life, like my daughter, because it's all, I want her to be empowered. I want young women to be empowered and confident, but also at the same time understand what the risks are. So it's a difficult line to tread, which I'm still trying to grapple with.
Yeah, it's hard to find the balance between those both.
Yeah.
So you mentioned how, we need to be like educating young men on this topic, and along with your past experiences, do you personally believe that the criminal justice system overall needs a lot of development and reform? to be able
Absolutely.
to do this.
It lets women down all the time, complete failure. The criminal justice system was designed by men for men, and especially when it comes to victims of rape and sexual assault, the criminal justice system repeatedly lets women down from the moment. And I will say that things have improved, and there is and especially in the last couple of years, because there's been such a spotlight shone on some very high profile cases, and it irritates me that it's taken these high profile cases for finally this real scrutiny to be taken with the criminal justice system. But we've got such a long, we have come a long way from, let's say, the 1980s, for example, where there was absolute open sexism, misogyny. But then listen, you just have to look at the headlines, right? I mean, look at the newspapers yesterday, and this made me so angry last night. I wanted to throw something at somebody, but luckily there was no one in the room to throw something at. So on the one hand, there's a headline about the Met Police. In the last year, there's been 1,500 complaints about sexual misconduct against officers in the Met. I mean, the Met is like in real trouble, right? The other headline is about a woman who's just been convicted for making a false allegation of rape. I know which of those will get the most traction, right? And it will be the one about the false allegation of rape. And what that does is perpetuate these myths about women, even though we know statistically that I think rape false allegations are like 0.00001 of all rape allegations. But of course, what happens, because we live in the world we live in, when you get an example of that, what that's doing is conforming or reinforcing the view, patriarchal male view of women, and that they lie about rape, they lie about sexual violence, and the other thing about the Met will just kind of disappear. It makes me so angry. So there's so many culpable organisations. The press are culpable, the general public are culpable, the criminal justice system are culpable, and things are changing, but they're changing way too slowly. And really, we're in 2023. The fact that we're still talking about these things and looking for just sort of parity and justice for women in the criminal, just to get the outcomes they need. I mean, the chances of getting a conviction in rape cases, you probably know the stats are so incredibly small, just to get past the police, and then you've got to get through to someone being actually arrested for it, then you've got to get through the CPS, then you've got to get through to court. And we've done research at every stage of that system, and it shows clearly that the odds are stacked against a woman. Just the way we talk about things like that in the criminal justice system, we always talk about rape as alleged, right? How that must feel for women, the alleged rape. We don't say the alleged burglary, but we've got this language that surrounds sexual violence against women. Women aren't even victims in the court of law, they're witnesses, right? Because it's so heavily stacked against the woman or a female. So you probably realise I feel quite passionate about this, and I think we need to keep banging on about this in research terms, but you as young women as well need to really be vocal about it, because it's not acceptable. We shouldn't accept it, and the more we can do to expose these things and actually change the conversation and the narrative, the better a future you will have, I'll have, and your children will have, your female children will have, and your boys as well. We need to stop talking to girls about them altering their behaviour. Don't dress like that. Make sure you're with a friend. It's always putting the onus on the girls. We be talking to young boys and saying, making sure they understand how they need to be behaving, right? they need to take the responsibility, not women. We should be able to dress how we bloody want to, yeah, walk where we want to, and do what we want to without fear of violence at every turn.
Yeah, of course. It definitely seems that women have unequal rights within the system, and you know, it's obvious within society and every element. And I guess, as you said, like, you can look at the statistics and you see for rape that it's so underreported because they have that fear that they're going to go to the police and the police won't do anything about it. They won't go and get the person that harmed them, and then they're going to be at more risk because, you know, they've gone to the police for it. And I think, as you mentioned, it's all an aspect of education that everybody needs to be educated on this, so it does change, because if we don't, then there will be no development in it.
Yeah, there are women who are a disadvantage before they even open their mouths, right? Because you always, and I think you start thinking about, well, you know, how am I going to be judged? Okay, yeah, I had a few drinks. Yeah, I was, you know, wearing a short skirt. And so we buy into these myths ourselves and stereotypes and start to question our own victimization based on our behaviour, and it's nothing to do with it, right? And then you think, well, if I go to the police, they're not going to believe me. They think, they'll think, you know, I had a few drinks, so, and why were you walking in that? Why were you walking home on your own? You know, there's all of these narratives that are going on, and you know, it's really, really difficult and very sad that we haven't managed to sort these out yet.
Yeah.
So could you tell us about a case that you found interesting working on, and any new discoveries or new developments in the industry that you made?
Okay, those are two very different questions. So I'll start with an interesting case. And then the second one was new discoveries.
Yeah, and new developments.
New developments, did you say?
Yeah.
Okay. So interesting case. Oh, I've got lots of interesting cases. What's the one? So I'm sort of sidelining a little bit. So one of the other areas I'm really interested in is something called geographic profiling, which I've actually come to Hills to talk about before. And that's sort of looking at the locations where offenders commit their crimes in order to help predict where they might live. So usually looking at serial offenders and sort of applying some quite high-level statistical techniques, as well as some sort of psychological concepts to someone's behaviour, to try and uncover information that will help the police narrow down a sort of search area for where an offender might live. And I find that in that side of my job, I find endlessly fascinating, because while every offender is different, or every case is different, there are these sort of unifying patterns that run through, and these are these sort of fundamental concepts around how people, actually, not just offenders, use their environments and exploit their environments for various means. But I guess with that in mind, one case that I worked on, which was in New Zealand, I don't know if I spoke about this before, but anyway, I guess it doesn't matter, was the disappearance. And one of the things that really interests me is where you have a case of what we call a missing murdered person, where someone's missing and they're presumed murdered. Mm-hmm. So they've gone from a report of someone being missing to the police having enough evidence to suspect that they've been actually murdered. But of course, they're then in a situation where they have this suspicion, but no body. And of course, finding an actual body in a case is really important, not only because it provides a great deal of evidence and actually, proves, that a murder has taken place, but also in terms of closure for a family, if that's the case. So I worked on one case where there was a young law student from Wellington University, which is where my daughter's now studying after Hills Road. She's gone there to study philosophy. Went missing one afternoon when last trace of him was he logged off the university computer system about 6 o'clock in the evening, and then he just disappeared, vanished without a trace. and his family, and this is often the case, his family very quickly not only got in touch with the police and said he's missing, and we're very worried about him because, of course, the family knew how out of character something like this would be. And this was a student who was very studious. The police just thought, university student, he's gone off on a bender somewhere. He'll emerge hungover at some point back home. But his family knew him very differently and knew exactly the type of person he was, and knew he wasn't like that. So they were worried, and the police didn't treat it continued to treat it as just a missing persons case for quite some time, to the point where the family hired a private detective to start to look into it because they were so concerned. And eventually, after some time, the police started to realise that actually there might be more to this and they should upgrade the investigation, not into murder, but upgrade the investigation. And once they started really looking into it, and I wasn't involved at this point yet, they realised that actually what they had was some very, very worrying. They uncovered some worrying things, such as they found some of his blood in a carpet in his old flat, and they eventually got to the point where they had a suspect in mind, and they thought that this suspect had actually done harm to this young university student, but they didn't have a body. And that makes it really difficult to progress an investigation. And so I'm used to looking at investigations where either a body's been found or we have a live victim, and I can talk to him or her, and there's a lot of rich evidence that can come from both of those scenarios. And so we have an actual, and with that locations. So this was very different. So the police came to me with a piece of a bit of a what's the word I'm looking for? It was like a sort of clue, I guess you'd call it, that they wanted to understand how to interpret it from a sort of psychology point of view. So what had happened is that this individual who was suspected of the crime had been arrested and charged with the murder of this young boy, this young university student. But they had no body. But you can still charge people. In fact, people have been convicted. Not many, but they're very rare. But you can convict someone when nobody's been found. So the police obviously really wanted to locate the body of this person. So once they'd arrested this chap, he actually got committed for psychiatric assessment. And while he was in this psychiatric institution being evaluated, he took a piece of paper one day and drew on this small sort of A5 piece of paper what looked like a sort of map. And the police brought it to me in this sealed evidence bag and sat down in my office at the university and said, "We've had this, can you help us sort of understand this? We've never come across anything like this before." And I took this piece of paper out, and it had this hand-drawn map with some landmarks on it, some roads, pine trees, all these little sort of tiny, very micro environment land area. And then in the corner it said body here and head here in two different areas. And their question to me was, should we believe this? Is this the sort of thing an offender would do? Mm-hmm. And B, if we are going to believe it, how accurate are these sorts of maps that people draw? Because obviously we want to identify, if we think this is where this person's body is, we want to be able to translate this map, this offender's mental map, into the real landscape. So it was a really interesting case. So what I had to do then was draw on my sort of background, my psychology background, my environmental psychology background, in terms of how people make sense of their environments and how they have mental maps, how we use to, how we navigate around. Sorry, I just got to charge my phone. How we navigate and how we use mental maps to navigate and remember places. And we do find this with offenders, especially if offenders want to revisit crime scenes, and we found that this actually was the case in this particular case. Then they will often have landmarks, usually quite natural ones, that will help them re-navigate back to a particular spot. So what happened was, I made the judgment that yes, this was worth looking at, and B, what we needed to do was try and actually identify the location and then try and sort of map out where these various locations were. So it was a really fascinating case, because it meant what I could do was use that psychological knowledge that I have, and actually apply it to really trying to interpret the mind map of the map of someone's mental map back into the real environment. And to cut a long story short, because it was quite a long story, after we located the area of north of Wellington, which was right out in the bush, very remote, difficult terrain to navigate, certainly to do a sort of fingertip search through. We cornered off quite a large area based on this map, and it was really interesting when we travelled up there. It was like, okay, there's the pine trees, there's the glade, and so then it was like, okay, so we've got those two key landmarks where we need now to try and extrapolate and locate where the body is, if it is indeed there. And I think it was after about 6 days of searching, painstaking, hands and knees searching, not me, obviously the police, that indeed the grave of Gavin Dash, his name, was discovered exactly as described on the map, with his body in one location and his head in another under a tree stump. So absolutely fascinating case, and it will stay with me for a long time. I've never done anything like it since, actually. Sorry, that was a long story.
That was interesting.
Yeah, so you mentioned how the mental map of the suspect helped you find the body. When we're talking about mental maps, would you say that a criminal's mental map of his environment is very different to a non-criminal's mental map of their environment, or is it very hard to distinguish between the two?
It's a really, really good question. I think what we would say is fundamentally they will be the same, because our sort of spatial, how we learn to navigate and learn about our environment is the same, because we're all human. However, what we want to use our environment for, and how we then sort of scan and utilise the environment for opportunities is going to be different depending on who we are. But the fundamental processes in terms of how we move around, we understand, distance perception, these sorts of things, they change. So we know mental maps can differ according to people's backgrounds and experiences, but it's not just a difference between criminals and non-criminals. It's much more about how, so for example, so you guys are all in Cambridge, right? So if I sat down with your group of you, all of you who are studying psychology, and I asked you to do the same, to draw a map of Cambridge, every one of you, while there'd be overlaps, you'd probably all have Hills Road on it, you'd all draw slightly different maps, because they're based on your experience and your understanding, but they are all underpinned by the same processes, the way we understand and make sense of our surroundings.
Yeah, so following on from that, would you say that our mental maps largely impacted by our childhood and how we're raised, and the combination of both nature and nurture, and just what occurs during the critical period?
No, not necessarily. I don't think that's the most important thing by any means. No, I think our mental maps, and when I'm talking about mental maps, we're talking really about the sort of how extensive they are and what they're made up of. Yeah. So there's a really great study done by Kevin Lynch in the 1960s, I think. What was it called? Image of Place or something, and he did sort of one of the first studies around how people make and navigate their way around cities. and how some people have a really good sense of direction and others don't, and how some people can go to a city once and then they'll return again and they can remember it and know it really well. And he came up with this classification scheme that everyone's mental maps is made up of 5 key components. Some will be more nodes, paths, edges, districts, and I can't remember the 5th. Nodes and paths are probably the most important, and they relate entirely to those places where we spend most of our time and the pathways between them. And that, and the extent to which they're developed will depend on how much interaction people have with those environments. They change, they're forever evolving all the time. They're filling in, they're getting more detailed. So it's very much dependent on, not on your upbringing or your childhood, unless of course you stayed in the same location and that mental map is, you haven't, but your mental maps are things that evolve without you through life, because they are so they're absolutely interdependent with your environment. But we have found differences with them and I suppose, illustrate that. There is research, although I think it's a little shaky on the ground, to be honest. So that has found, so for example, depending on your life opportunities, your background, you might find, for example, that certainly there's been some studies in some cities in the US which are quite heavily ghettoized still, and there's very sort of clear areas where African American people live and then white people live, and you can see that effect coming through in people's mental maps. You see very clear edges of, sort of almost cliff edges of people from one area who say, just have no understanding or awareness over there, because actually they never go there because they're worried they'd get shot. Like young black people going into a really I don't know, to a white neighborhood. Those are the sorts of things that happen. So it's more about your immediate understanding, your immediate environment, rather than anything about your upbringing. But your upbringing can influence how, I suppose, your mobility in a way, possibly. I don't know, it's a bit of a tenuous link, but yeah.
Yeah, so obviously you need a lot of equipment in order to help solve a case. So how much do you think the forensic field developed over the years, and did the newer technologies help to solve cold cases from the past?
Oh yeah, amazing, absolutely. The developments in forensic techniques are phenomenal. I mean, it's not my area by any means. I obviously work hand in hand with forensic scientists, but I am no expert. But certainly some of the breakthroughs that have occurred, obviously DNA being one. I mean, fingerprinting obviously going back beforehand, but the improvements in DNA profiling and other forensic techniques, forensic sort of techniques around sort of recreating, facial reconstruction, that sort of thing. I mean, they're endless, and they have made such a big difference. And you're right in terms of the cold case side of it. I've just finished. It's on TV at BBC One at the minute, a documentary series where we do look at cold cases through sort of modern day policing techniques, including profiling, that I'm obviously is my area of expertise, but also other forensic techniques. And we've been looking at cases that have been cracked basically through the application of modern day forensic techniques to cold cases that have been, the evidence has been locked away for 20, 30, 40, 50 years in an evidence room in the depths of a police station. And these modern DNA profiling techniques, for example, have managed to take a tiny spot of blood that has been is 40, 50 years old, and managed to get a profile that has actually led to the arrest of somebody. So it's wonderful, and it keeps on developing all the time. So together with the sort of work I do, I mean, the forensic stuff is obviously much more of a science, and for a start, admissible in court. The work I do is not yet admissible in UK courts, but it's nevertheless, useful help in terms of narrowing down or helping to prioritise police investigations or searches for people.
That's really interesting.
Okay, so just to end it, what advice would you give someone who's considering a career in forensic psychology or looking to go into that field in the future?
What advice? Okay, so I would say be prepared to be in it for the long haul in terms of study.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'd probably, most of the people that my contemporaries in the field have, obviously degrees, but also, and it depends. When you said forensic, did you say forensic psychology?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so that's much broader. So actually, I think, well, obviously, education is really important. Make sure you do a degree that, if you're doing it here, that's BPS accredited. It's not crowded, it's competitive. So my advice, not just about getting into forensic psychology, this is my advice to anyone embarking on a university degree, is wring every opportunity, make the most of every opportunity you can that comes your way. And a lot of university degrees will give you lots of opportunities to, either do some research with one of the academics, go and visit a prison, or go and actually do some work with offenders, those sorts of things. Take every opportunity you can, because those are the sorts of things that will set you apart from your contemporaries who didn't take those opportunities. And believe me, there are a lot of students that don't take those opportunities. If you want to go into specialise in sort of the field I'm in, like geographical or offender profiling, then there aren't necessarily jobs. You can't become a geographic or offender profiler and get paid for it. You kind of have to go down the route that I have, which is being a researcher, an academic, and then working with the police as part of that. So much more research based. And then obviously the advice would be to do a PhD, get your doctorate, and get a good academic starting position from there. But that's very different from someone who perhaps wants to go into clinical practice and actually work with, I don't know, let's say offenders in a prison environment. That's very, very different, and that's a very different route. So I guess there's forensic psychology is as broad as it is wide. It's anything, isn't it, to do with the courts, the criminal justice system, and you can take it in any number of directions. So I guess the thing to do, my main piece of advice is to, work hard, because the harder you work, the better the more opportunities you have. Take every opportunity you can get. Don't be afraid. And I say this to whoever's listening, the girls listening to this, because it's something that I've learnt myself, but I've also witnessed as well, is don't believe in yourselves. Don't be afraid to put yourself forward for things, and believe that you are totally good enough to do them. Because I've seen a lot of times, and as I say, I've done it myself in my early career, where I've sort of stood back a bit and thought, no, I don't think I can quite do that. At the end of the day, what's the worst thing that can happen? So just be confident and get out there, and that would be, I think, my main advice.
Thank you.
Yeah, that sounds great. Just linking onto your specialised field of geographical profiling, I think you mentioned that sometimes there are like patterns within it. Has there ever been a case where you've been wrong about it?
Yeah, loads. Yeah, it's not an exact science. So what we try and do, though, is every time I do profile a case, it's about then feeding that learning back into my research. So all the time I'm looking at, and the thing is, offenders will always surprise you, certainly often in the way they do things, but the geography, when you unpick the geography, even if you haven't quite, the profile has been a bit, inaccurate, and that might be, for example, what geographic profiling has its confines. What it tends to do is it will predict a sort of centre of gravity, an anchor, if you like, sort of a place that is at the sort of heart of that offending pattern. But of course, that place is not necessarily where someone lives. It usually is, but if an offender's been operating, for example, from his mate's house down the road, or 10 miles away, then and sort of commuting into an area back to where he offends, then unless so the pattern is round his friend's house, we won't have that detail in the databases, in the police databases. So all we typically have, indeed, if someone is in the police databases, will be a home address. So there are ways and means that things can go wrong, and that's why these techniques are never ever used to exclude anybody from an investigation. They're not admissible in court, and they're only ever used as a sort of additional tool for the police to help sort of prioritise suspect or search areas or whatever it might be. It would never ever be used to just say, well, that person clearly isn't the killer because they don't live in that location predicted by the geographic profile. That would never happen. And what we try and do is if after every case, once someone eventually is arrested and convicted for a crime, then I will uncover, look at their lifestyle, look at the details of their offending, and apply it back to the crime pattern that I looked at when I didn't know who it was. And I promise you, without exception, there is always a logic to those points, on those dots on the map that I've looked at. As soon as you understand about the lifestyle, the experiences, the way an offender, where an offender spends most of his time, you can absolutely uncover and understand the patterns that he leaves behind in his offending.
Oh wow, yeah, that's really interesting and insightful. Thank you again for giving up your time to do this interview with us today.
No problem at all.
Stay tuned for the third episode and stay safe.